So we are continuing with the history of people who followed God's will, and last week we spoke about Isaac, and this week we will continue with Jacob. And we first read in Genesis 27. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he couldn't see, he called his eldest son Esau and said to him, "My son," and he answered, "Here I am." He said, "See, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Then prepare for me savory food, such as I like, and bring it to me to eat, so that I may bless you before I die." Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "I heard your father say to your brother Esau, 'Bring me game and prepare for me savory food to eat, that I may bless you before the Lord before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my words as I command you.'" So that was the Bible verse for today. So last week we finished the history of Abraham, and we continued the history of the Bible. But before we just go through the history of the Bible, we also observed and tried to understand what character God has. And God is someone who works through the people while he respects the free will he gave to human beings. So he calls the people first, he invites them, and if they answer, he leads them so that they can fulfill his will to those who come in faith. So it's not fatalism that God already predetermines every single action of a human being, so that he has no choice but to follow the run of history God predefined, but he is respecting God's human's free will. So this is why it is so important to understand the Bible, and also to understand who God is, and also how he works throughout the history. And only if we understand correctly who God is, how he works, we also understand the history of the Bible and the message properly. And equally, it's important to understand the historical background of the time of the Bible stories, so that we get a complete picture. So whether we concentrate on predestination, or if we concentrate on obedience, in the end, what we should acknowledge is that God's work is not fatalistic, but we should understand also why each person in the Bible described, we should understand why they chose to act a certain way, and also what was God's influence to that. So it's only possible to understand the Bible properly by remembering the basics of God's work within the framework of free will, and free will is a gift from God. So it's not about fatalism, predeterminism when we read the story of the Bible. So we looked at the story of Isaac, the son of Abraham, and Isaac wasn't automatically predestined and chosen by God with special benefits, but he also personally responded to the call of God, and he learned God's will from his father Abraham first. And because Isaac was someone who lived a life of obedience to the word of God, he was able to achieve and follow God's guidance. In many cases, and in many sermons also, you will hear description where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are pre-selected, right? Predestined and already chosen and preformed to do their actions and to do God's will. And that they were especially blessed by God to do God's will. But the history of the Bible isn't about, or the focus in the Bible is not about blessing. It is about the story of God, how he works to save the people. How God's dreams and promises are fulfilled through those who followed his words. So looking at the life of Isaac last week, if we look at the chapter 26, we can see that he has a very similar life like his father Abraham. And the story of Isaac continues in chapter 27. But we can already see that in chapter 27, the focus or the main character of the book of Genesis chapter 27 is already his son Jacob. So the history or the story leads from Abraham to Isaac, and then after a very short term already to Jacob. So Isaac's story is rather brief and short if you compare it to Abraham or Jacob. And Jacob's story will continue until Genesis 36. And we can also see that Jacob's story, his life was rather complicated. After he ran away from home because of the conflict with his brother, he went to Haran, his hometown of his father and mother, and lived there for a total of 20 years and has in total 4 wives and 12 children. And when he returns to Canaan, then there is a inner family conflict. We all know the story of the brothers being jealous of Joseph, Jacob's favorite son, and then because of this jealousy, they sell him into slavery. In the end, the whole family moves to Egypt, where they meet Joseph again, and then in the end, Jacob dies in Egypt. And Jacob's life is very dynamic, very complicated, and we can also find a lot of items that are very similar to reality, to things that we experience in our nowadays lives as well. So by examining Jacob's life story, we'll also learn a lot about how to live on this earth and what it means to follow God's promises and what it means to keep faith in the circumstances we are given. So from the story of Abraham and onwards, we looked at people who were examples of people living a healthy life in God. And what we could learn out of this is living on this earth means that there are 3 different influences, which are materials, relationship to other humans, and our relationship to God. And we need to understand this balance or the connection between those 3. So if we do not have material things, we are in problems. If we don't have a good relationship to other humans, we're in trouble. But also, of course, if we're not in a proper relationship to God, we are in trouble. So those 3 items or those 3 elements need to be well understood. And we also need to live with the right priorities in these 3 relationships. And the difference between if we are mature or immature as saints, as Christians or as faithful people is understanding how we prioritize those 3 relationships. And those who were able to discern, to understand the right balance, were those who were mature or were successful in their faithful life. We remember when we spoke about Abraham's overall life that he was able to understand the right priorities and trust God. We remember the incident or the scene where he and his nephew Lot and their tribes had conflict and they had to split ways. And Abraham did the right thing by prioritizing God first rather than materials. And this is in the end why he got blessed, while Lot and his family in the end ended up in a disaster. And further on, Abraham showed in many cases how he prioritized God first. Also when he, for example, went through the process of expelling Ishmael, his first son. And in the end, he lived a life that God chose. And God even called him a companion of God, or even his friend, because he was so faithful. And also Isaac was similar like that. Isaac also followed God's call and lived a life within God's commandments. And he also had conflicts, just like Abraham had. He had conflict with the Philistines. And the Philistines tried to take away Isaac's goods. But he didn't fight back. But still, through God's help, in the end, Abimelech, the king of Philistines, came to Isaac and offered to make a pact, a peaceful pact, just like Abraham got peaceful pact with powerful nations. And in the end, the story of his sons and the blessing of the firstborn, we can see that even though he did a mistake, or he got tricked by not blessing his first son rather than the younger brother, he didn't insist on his own thoughts, but he understood that he had to obey according to what God had foreseen. It is a bit comparable to when Abraham expelled his firstborn. Also, Jacob in the end blessed the younger brother of his twins. So, if the priorities for the relationships between material and human and God are properly and correctly established, this is the way how we can live a life by faith, which is truly precious and really unique within God's guidance. And this is why it's important to set those priorities correct from a very young age. A person shouldn't waste too much time with wrong priorities, but concentrate on God and on spiritual influence, so that our kids and the young people also can live as role models like David, Daniel and his friends, and other role models that we can find in the Bible. But also sometimes, if we do not set the priorities correctly, if we try to do too much on our own thoughts, we can also, even though we are faithful, have a complicated life. Jacob is one of the examples where his life got tough for the rest of his entire journey. So I pray to you that we will become children of God who cherish time that is given to us, and that we are able to rightly and quickly set the right priorities in the relations between material, people, and God. So now, continuing to take a look at the story, we need to understand the big picture, the bigger frame and setting within this Bible story. So between the end of chapter 26 and the chapter 27, around 30 to 40 years passed. So Isaac met Rebekah at the age of 40. He married Rebekah and had twins, Esau and Jacob, at the age of 60. Abraham dies at the age of 175. So at that time, Isaac was 75 and the twins were 15 years old. So Esau and Jacob, the twins, also lived with Abraham for about 15 years. And when Jacob and Esau were in their 20s or 30s, this must be the time when Jacob and Esau had their deal, or their discussion about the birthright with the bowl of bean soup. You remember where Jacob makes a deal with the hungry older brother and takes away the right of the firstborn. And when Esau was around 40, he marries a Hittite woman, and chapter 27 is when about 37 years also have passed. So, what kind of people were Isaac, Rebekah, Esau, and Jacob? They all were people who knew and learned about God's true will. And they were all Abraham's successors, so they learned about it, and they should be living according to it. Esau, the older brother, had married a Canaanite Hittite woman in his 40s, and he lived a life that was more concentrating on his own satisfaction. So the last 37 years he just lived a very worldly life. Jacob, who wasn't necessarily at that time already the subject of God's great foreseen promise, it seems that he was the one of the two brothers who knew and believed God's promise and was living according to that. So after Esau married this Canaanite woman at the age of 40, Jacob, the younger brother, still did not mix with or get engaged to Canaanite women until the age of 77. And there we can see that he was the one of the two living in faith and following God's promises. So, how did they live? So when we listen, there are many sermons about the life of Isaac, and we can assume that Isaac lived a life until he was 137 years old, and even though he was obedient to God, he probably lived an ordinary life and saw his children growing up. And in the end, we also see that he and his wife had different perceptions of their children. So Isaac seems to like Esau, the older brother, and Rebekah seems to prefer Jacob. But if we see it that way, it could also seem that the couple had a very dysfunctional relationship. But fact is, it's about more than 37 years that passed between the two books, and there is not enough information to really understand what happened between those years. So we shouldn't just have prejudices of what happened during that time. We should rather look at the Bible and understand what is fact, so that we don't start to misinterpret the story of the Bible. Because we will see in many cases of the Bible that there are cases where the time intervals, the time that passes between two books is greater than we expect. It's not that just every story is continuous and connected directly in time. Just like the example today, sometimes there's a greater time that passes, and also very limited information on what happens during this time. The problem I want to point out today is that there are many sermons in many churches that mostly deal and concentrate on topics of how to receive blessing and how to be chosen, right? And this is why mostly people try to see the way how, because of some special instances and actions, someone gets chosen or especially blessed. And this can also give us the impression that there is God's absolute choice and God's absolute predestination, and that some people might misunderstand that our life is completely predefined, and it is a fatalistic life set by God. But we shouldn't forget that in the end God gave us a free will, and it is in the end also our decision to follow God. And if we do not, and if we just follow our own instincts, our own greed, we can still end up in eternal death. So even though there are not many, there's no record on how Isaac and Rebekah's and also the twins Esau and Jacob's life was during those 30 plus years. There is some information on the characters in chapter 25, and when we meditate on God's personality, how God works, we can also understand how God works and how God does His decisions and how He calls people. So first of all, we have to consider what happens in chapter 27 isn't what happens when Esau and Jacob are very young. What we often think when we just hear the stories from what we heard in Bible school. It is necessary to understand that it is happening at the age of 77 of both men. So keeping this in mind, and then looking at chapter 27, we also understand what it means if Jacob deceives his father Isaac to receive the blessing of being the firstborn. And also Isaac was so old that he understood that his life might soon come to an end. He recognized that he's losing his sight, and before he was too old, before he might not be in a healthy condition to bless his firstborn, he was in a hurry to do so. And because of that pressure, he called his firstborn Esau, the eldest son, and he was a hunter. His oldest son was a skilled hunter, so he asked him to bring his favorite dish he loved so much, and then he would eat. And after that, he wanted to bless his eldest son to transfer or to hand over the future responsibility and the lead of his people. But Rebecca, his wife, also heard this conversation her husband had with her firstborn, and she then calls Jacob, the younger son, and asks him to quickly slaughter a goat and make his father's favorite food, give it to his father, and just in the end to trick her husband that her younger son would receive the blessing of the firstborn instead of Esau. So this is the story of the chapter 27, how in the end within this family the right of the firstborn is transferred from the first to the second son. But now think about Rebecca. What was her motivation for her actions? I mean, she had twin sons. They were actually the same age. One was just the firstborn. Why would she prefer Jacob to receive the blessing rather than Esau? Is it because she just liked Jacob more, because she was closer to him and loved him more than Esau? Or did she maybe remember what God's greater plan was, and maybe she already knew this from an early age by observing her children or by praying for them? There are many questions, and what we can think or maybe understand is that Rebecca, also like the rest of the family, knew the promise of God through her father-in-law Abraham. They all, of course, tried to live according to these values. But she must have observed that Esau, her eldest son of the family, didn't really show the interest or didn't really show the motivation to follow the tradition of the family or the promise God had given to Abraham. So it is not because she hated Esau or because she loved Joseph more than Esau, but we can assume that she understood that if Esau would represent the entire family in the future, this could mean that the whole tribe, that the whole family, that all people would completely, in the end, absorbed into the land of Canaan rather than following God's promise, because Esau had demonstrated this behavior in his life already by marrying a Canaanite woman. So, we can, in the contrary to that, we can see that Jacob, the second-born, didn't open up his life to Canaan, and Rebecca probably understood this and thought that if Jacob would get the blessing, he would follow the value of God's leadership and of faith and would be the better leader for the future. And if we look at chapter 26, we can even see that Esau took a Canaanite woman for his wife at the age of 40, but he didn't only take one wife, he obviously even took two wives. And this must have been something that also Isaac and Rebecca, both as parents, must have been worried about, understanding the influence it can have. So marriage is something very important, something to be blessed, of course, but also very central and focused in the life. And we can assume that Isaac and Rebecca educated their children in the ways of obeying God. And it wasn't just like that they didn't like women from Canaan. It's not just that the parents didn't want to approve a certain woman. It is because they fully understood the spiritual influences that this would have. And they knew that the whole life, every word, action, every circumstance in the life would get influenced by the partner that they would choose. And this is why they want to, why they preferred someone from their own people, so that their faith could be protected. And they must have been worried seeing that Esau would take a Canaanite woman. So Rebekah must have educated Jacob and Esau both, and tried to lead them to the right path. But Esau, despite this education, wasn't really interested. This is what we can see through the information we find in the Bible. So when Rebekah saw that her husband still wanted to bless Esau, she made a big decision and took action to change the blessing of the birthright of her children. Through this action, she tried to influence and control and also set the right path of keeping what she learned through her father-in-law Abraham. She tried to, through her own actions, keep God's promise in the family. So what we can assume is that Rebekah fully understood God's path. She fully absorbed and accepted all the teachings she received from Abraham, her father-in-law. And what we can also assume is that beyond what Abraham taught, she herself tried to live according to the faith of God. So it was more than just being married to Abraham's son. It was her own decision to follow God's path. And seeing this, we also can understand that a woman, also back in that time, is not just a man's accessory, but we can see that they are equal partners who can actually support each other, who can actually both influence equally to accomplish God's will. And if we look at the Bible, we can see that God's will, God's history is absolutely not fulfilled and accomplished only through the man. And if we look at the history until Jesus Christ, we see that many women in the genealogy of Jesus are mentioned, and that they are equally good and great examples how people followed the word of faith and how they lived a life of obedience to God's word. And this is why we can see that even Gentile women and a lot of great women are presented in the bloodline of Jesus. So Rebekah also was someone who lived her life in faith. She was also a person who wanted to fulfill God's promise. And when she gave birth to her two children, we can assume that she diligently educated her children to live according to God's will. And Rebekah probably also expected her eldest son Esau to follow her grandfather and her father's footsteps. But despite Rebekah's education, Esau just didn't show any interest in that. He didn't show any interest in spiritual things, and by marrying the Canaanite woman and by living and following the worldly culture, Rebekah, who was a woman of faith, knew that Esau wouldn't be the right leader. So what she did, what she planned to deceive her husband, what she did together with Jacob, was her decision to keep God's promises. So now, with the greater understanding and greater picture what Rebecca did and who she was and what her motivation is, we can now also understand that this story of the right of firstborn isn't just a story of a couple with different opinions, where the father likes one son better and the mother likes the other son better, and this is just an internal family conflict. This is way more than that. This is a story of a faithful woman who, in her own decision, thought that she would do the right thing to keep God's promises. It's much greater than the stories we heard before. But still, even though we can see that Rebecca was a faithful person, we can also see some issues with this story. So when we were in Rebecca's situation, what we personally do, we should meditate about this. Rebecca did a certain action, but the Bible doesn't necessarily only show actions of people who did the right thing. The Bible doesn't hide mistakes people do. It authentically shows even mistakes people did. And another example was Abraham's story of getting his firstborn that we discussed a couple of weeks ago, where he couldn't wait for God's promise, and then he chose a natural way to get his firstborn. And here again is a very similar situation where a person decided to do something following God's promise, but decided to do it a natural, a worldly, a human way. So in the end, because Rebecca thought she needs to get into action, she in the end tricks her own husband. She in the end makes or supports her younger son of becoming a liar. And in the end, even though the history follows with Jacob being the leader of the family, it isn't without consequences. So Rebecca is showing similar immaturity behaviors as Abraham did throughout his life, by trying to follow God's will, but with own thoughts and own ideas. So if we understand the culture of that time, the patriarch, the leader of a tribe, had also the opportunity to hand over the authority to the second or to the younger sons if there was a good reason. So we have proof that it wasn't inevitable to that Jacob would bless Esau. So there were other ways. Maybe if Jacob and Rebecca sat together and had a good discussion or a good prayer, and in the end they could have decided differently. But in the end, just like Abraham did, Rebecca chose a worldly way to set the path of the further history of God's people. And that also can apply to us. There are situations where we think that because we have good intentions, we can use worldly methods to achieve those. But with good intentions, we sometimes choose wrong methods, or we sometimes, without asking for God's support, realize our own ideas. And this can also, in the end, lead to consequences for our lives. And this is very similar to what we see in the Bible, where we look the way God works, because we are human and we cannot live completely without mistakes. So we do a lot of mistakes, sometimes even fatal mistakes. And but still, God doesn't let go from those people He called. He then uses those failures or mistakes as stepping stones to grow. So we live in a very complex world, and there can be mistakes, sometimes irreversible mistakes created by me or by you or by any one of us. And we should use those as stepping stones to grow. And this is also a very important part of faith. So if we did mistakes, if there were failures in our life, we shouldn't despair or be crooked. We should learn from those mistakes. We should stand up again, and also decide to not to repeat the same mistake. This is how we can also walk the path of God's calling and grow within that. So the present time is the time God has given to us. So we are living in the present. But of course we also could choose to live according to our beliefs, to our instincts, to our greed. We have the freedom to choose, but once we make a choice, we will have to live with the consequences. And this is why it's important to look at our past also, to learn from it, and to do better decisions next time. So we shouldn't follow just our emotions or feelings, but we should base our decisions we do on the value of the word. So after Rebecca did those actions, what did Jacob think? Now let's look at Jacob. Jacob also must have been worried what would happen as a consequence of lying to his father and also tricking his brother. But again, we shouldn't see this as a story of a young boy who was unable to form an own opinion and was just convinced or pressurized by his mother, a little mama boy who just followed what his mother said. Jacob was 77 years old when this happened. He was a mature man. He was an old man, experienced and able to do his own decisions, but still he decided to be part of this action. So it is difficult to just say he was entirely under the influence of his mother because he was just a young boy. He knew that this was a bigger step. And maybe he himself also saw that his older brother might not be the right person. This is also a possible interpretation that he understood why his parents were worried with his older brother, and so he decided to participate in his mother's plan. So even though we can question Rebecca's plan as it is, we should also ask ourselves, are we brave enough, just like Rebecca was, to take a risky decision to keep and protect God's values within our family, to keep God's promises God had given to her husband, and to her children. So as I said before, of course there might have been another option that she might have discussed with Jacob, with Isaac, and made a combined decision to not appoint Esau as the leader, but rather hand this over to the younger son. So there was an opportunity also within that the regulations of that time, as we discussed before. So it is not the ideal solution for this situation. This is what we can maybe take away from this. But still, we should also understand that Rebecca was a brave person to choose God's plan first before the worldly birthrights. So now, through this story again, we can once more understand how important it is to make right choices, right decisions, even if it is a risk, in order to follow the faith, just like Rebecca did. But also, we need to understand that it is necessary, if we want to keep our faith, that we are wise within God's will, so that we do everything and do our decisions and actions based on God's will and not on human thoughts to fulfill God's plan. So Abraham, Rebecca's father-in-law, in the end, was the person who chose Rebecca for his son Isaac as his daughter-in-law, as Isaac's husband. And we can see that also that was a rather difficult decision, or difficult action, but in the end it was a good decision because Rebecca proved that she is a faithful person. So even though it must have been inconvenient and complicated to get Rebecca as Isaac's wife, it was a very good and truly outstanding choice that Abraham did in the end. So we remember the story where he sent a servant to his sons, to his hometown to find a wife and so on. And in the end, it was a good decision that his son married a godly woman rather than a worldly woman. So this again also shows the importance of marriage within God-fearing people. When a person becomes a member of a family of faith, they together have to know the value of faith and also in combined strength have to follow it. So to all those who are getting married, they should please consider what is important if you go into a partnership, because in the end the whole family should be formed according to the values of God has given us. And of course, those who are married, equally it is important to become a community in faith and become united within God's will, just like and that man and that husband and wife, just like Rebecca and Isaac, both should follow God's promise. Now let's look at the father. If we look at the text that continues in this story, so Jacob in the end had deceived his father and he stole the eldest son's blessing. But what did so from Isaac's, the father's point of view, after he found out what happened, he also could have stopped all the following consequences. He could have just said, okay, is that so? What happened? Jacob tricked me, then I will just cancel the blessing. I will just cancel everything that happened. I will call my eldest son again, bless him, and just expel Jacob. But Isaac didn't do that. He rather had the attitude that what had happened was inevitable and it should not be repeated. And why did he say that? According to Bible commentaries, we also can assume that Isaac believed that a blessing done before God is valid whatever way it was done. So even though his eldest son, Esau, later came to Jacob and with tears he asked Jacob to bless him also, in the end, he asked Isaac to bless him as well. Isaac still couldn't revert what he had done before. However, of course, we shouldn't think that taking away a blessing, taking away the birthright by a lie is something we should approve. It is illegal, or it is really a bad action. We should be aligned on that. But still, on the other hand, looking at the story of the twins Esau and Jacob so far, we can assume that not only Rebecca but also Isaac was aware and maybe even worried about his eldest son. And maybe Isaac was also concerned when he was preparing Esau to get the blessing. And he might also have been concerned because he knew that Esau was not a very spiritual person. But probably he had the hope that it would get better with time. So, but even though Isaac just hoped that with time Esau would maybe change, or with time the whole path would get resolved on its own. Now with this incident, Isaac also understood that he cannot let the promises of God just rest on his own expectations or just on rough hopes. So when Esau then came and asked Jacob to revert everything and get him his blessing, at this time Isaac probably also understood that the right person was now chosen, and that he also understood that Esau wasn't the right person from the very beginning. So very similar, like his father, who drove out, who expelled the older brother Ishmael, even though officially being the firstborn. Very similar to that, Isaac also chooses, Isaac also insists on, or stays with, the blessing of his second son, because he knew that he would be the better leader, and because he understood that this would be according to God's will. So Isaac knew from his father, what he learned from his father, what it would mean to keep God's promises and the covenants with God. And this is why in the end, when Esau also earnestly asked for a blessing, he didn't repeat it again. He stood by his decision before, and even though Esau was the eldest son, now the blessing went to the second-born. So what we can summarize is Isaac maybe previously thought that the order of birth, the physical birth, was the will of heaven. So just because Esau was the firstborn, he automatically should become the following leader. He should get the blessing. And this is why he tried to follow the rules of life. The firstborn is automatically the follow-up leader. But here again, he could also learn what is important. He woke up and he saw that it is important to choose the right person according to God's will. And we can see in chapter 28 when he calls Jacob, he could have scolded him for tricking him, but rather than scolding Jacob, he blesses him, and he again gives him the advice to not take a Canaanite woman as his wife, like his older brother, but go to Haran and take a person as his wife, just as he had married Rebekah himself. So in this point we see that Isaac understood and got aligned again to God's will and blesses Jacob. So what we can see here is that God's covenant with Abram flowed through Isaac, but then didn't go to Esau, but rather to Jacob, because Esau was a person who was indifferent to God's will. What kind of character Esau was is mentioned in chapter 25, but also in 26, and also shown here in 28. So Esau finds out that his father and mother hated his marriage to Canaanite women, but he still did it, right? And then when he understood that his parents were still unhappy, he takes another woman, but the next woman he marries is part of the tribe of Ishmael, the tribe that was driven out from the time of Abraham. This is his third wife, we can read in chapter 28. So what we can assume is, even though Esau to some extent reacts to the will of his parents, he didn't really understand the truth of God. He didn't really understand the true meaning of marriage, or he really didn't understand what it meant to be part of God's greater plan. So Esau didn't look for a woman who he could be a partner with to keep God's vision together as in a partnership. He was looking just for women that pleased him, or when his parents were unhappy, he was just looking for a different bloodline, but he really didn't care about if they were worthy of God's will. So we shouldn't think that Esau, from the very beginning, since birth, was already the person that was predestined to lose the birthright. But we can still assume that, understand that because of his decisions, because of his lifestyle, then in the end his younger brother got chosen. So if we open our heart a little more and listen to God's word, we can better understand what God's intention is. We shouldn't just get into a faith that is merely formal. When we look at the message of the Bible, we can see that God really hates people who have faith just in the outer shell, like Esau, the most. In the New Testament also, when Jesus rebuked the Pharisees, he rebuked them because of their outer faith and not having a faith in their hearts. They were just like Esau. So we should keep this fact in mind and walk the path of true faith in our hearts. So to conclude today's sermon, it's not just simply that Jacob and Esau were brothers that had a conflict, and that the parents had, let's say, a misaligned view on the children, and it was fatalism that God decided to choose Jacob instead of Esau. God knew the attitude and sincerity of both Jacob and Esau. And looking at this story, looking at today's story of Jacob and Esau and his parents, should help us to understand how important it is to live according to the values of God that God has spoken to us. God doesn't care about formal things God doesn't look at formal things if they are without a genuine heart. And Esau was just such a person who, to some extent, followed his parents' reactions, but really didn't look into the heart of them. It really didn't look at the heart of God. He was just like an outer shell, like an empty shell. Because in his heart, his actions showed that in his heart, he wasn't interested in the real plan God gave to his parents and, in the end, originally to him. So now, next week, we'll continue to share what the life of both brothers was like, and the further history of Jacob and Esau. So let's pray.